Welcome, everybody, to episode 124 of Access on Trial. Today we'll be discussing philosophy of time and physics with Dr. David. Thank you, David, for coming on again.
Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
So, for those who don't know, David was here for our very first episode, and he's been a recurring guest on the show, probably our most recurring guest. And every time that we've had him on, it's been pretty much my favorite episode so far. So, if you guys have any questions for us throughout the episode, just leave them in the comments, and as always, we'll address them as we go on. But yeah, David and I were on, I think, the Skeptic Haven channel a few days ago, talking about physics there as well, and I think this is somewhat of a continuation of that conversation. I guess I'll start out by saying that what my general concern is, and maybe David, you can help me figure out where you think I might be going wrong, or if there is some way to resolve these concerns that I have. My main concern is that while I understand and acknowledge and agree that modern science is to a large degree undermining our natural intuitions about the way things are, that there's a degree to which the findings that we then arrive at, there's a difficulty in expressing what it is that these discoveries are telling us about the real world. And so an example kind of related to our last conversation, one issue that I've had with theists in the past is when they've said things along the lines of God exists outside of space and time. And my response to that kind of statement was always, I don't know what existence means in a context that removes space and time from the conversation. And what we're talking about in the last conversation is that there's what was her name?
Ruth Kastner?
Ruth Kastner was suggesting something along the lines of that a potential interpretation of modern physics views space and time as not fundamental, but there is something that exists prior to space and time. And I have the same linguistic concerns there. It's, I don't know what that means, and if the objection is that I should reinterpret or reimagine what we mean by existence, then can you provide me a new context from which to understand existence in a way that is coherent?
Okay, well, maybe the first thing to notice is that language emerges from our perceptions of the world, right? Mm-hmm. Is that a fair statement?
I would say so.
Okay. And our perceptions of the world are not one-to-one with what's true. Mm-hmm. So we should expect that if we have a tool that gets us that moves us towards what's true, that there should be some tension between language and that truth.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's everyday experience tells us that whatever it is that we're talking about in the world involves space and time, or physical things, right? Because if we're talking about, if we're in the space of ideas, then that's a little different. But physical things that exist, right? Given our experience of the world, they seem to exist in terms of space and time.
By the way, I think I might be hearing a little bit of feedback from your headphones. I don't know if it's just me. Yeah, you might want to Maybe hold them so they're not moving around. I don't know. The microphone.
Maybe it's not plugged in all the way. Is that better?
I think the little microphone might be rubbing against.
Right here? Maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Maybe, where is it? Right here.
Yeah, I
Okay.
believe so.
Is that better?
I think so. Yeah.
Seems to be
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. So go on.
Yeah. So the first thing that I would point out is that we should expect some tension there. Right. We shouldn't expect language to be a perfect descriptor of the kinds of things we find as we go deeper in our exploration of nature. So, is that right? You agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. Like I'm the first to acknowledge and accept the fact that we have certain both linguistic and subjective limitations that prevent us from really uh, experiencing or potentially even knowing the way things objectively are. Um, and so that I'm on board with that.
Well, I'm not seeing a barrier. I'm not saying that it's a barrier. It's just a poor descriptor
Mhm.
because it's a descriptor that emerges in a certain context. And when we look deeper at the world, we realize that that's only a kind of emergent um, experience. It's an emergent world, but when we go deeper, we'll see that there are other kinds of structures, and we need to be able to describe them. And we just have a language that hasn't been developed enough to do that. So I
Right.
don't see it as a barrier. You seem to think that it's a kind of fundamental barrier.
I think so, but and I'll get to that in a little bit. But I'll explain why I have that viewpoint when we
Okay.
get to talk about consciousness. Um, but yeah, keep going.
No, I mean, so we can look at different aspects of modern physics and get a sense of where these strange features that seem to sort of at some level conflict with our experience and maybe they're even difficult to describe. So we can sort of ask ourselves, how much are we going to accept? What are we going to refute? Right? Because you want to be able to refute things that in some sense, from your perspective, there's no meaning there. And so let's look at what kinds of things we would get if we behaved in this way. So let's say that you take an introductory physics course, and the first thing that you study are what's called kinematic equations. So it's just basic physical processes, like an object. You throw this object off the table, and you want to find when the object hits. Things like how fast does it hit the ground, or when it hits the ground. Um, let's say you want to know how fast it goes when it hits the ground, and so your intuition is that the world that you're familiar with tells you that there must be a solution which gives me the time when the object hits the ground, and I'm going to there's only one time that's going to emerge from these equations. I insist on this, and there'll be a speed associated with that time, and I'll be able to get the speed with which the object hits the floor. A perfectly reasonable assumption or expectation, no?
Mhm.
And so I go and solve these equations, and I find that I don't have one time. There are two times. So what do we do with that, right? Is it fair? Do I have the right to say, well, look, this whole project of math describing the real world has failed at the most superficial level, right? Because I know the world involves some specific time. It's one time when this object hits the ground. And if math can't give it to me, then there isn't this tight relationship between the physical world and mathematics, because the math is giving me two solutions.
Right.
So you expect me to just ignore it. So that's what normally we do in an introductory physics course. We ignore the other time solution, and we choose the one that seems more reasonable.
Is there an explanation for why there's this two-time solution?
So if we go a little bit deeper, that we can see some strange features, and we can sort of get around this issue. But what I'm saying is that if we just sit there and insist that the world is a specific way, we're going to basically discard the project of modern science or
Right.
modern physics off the bat.
Right.
Right. So what seems to be the explanation of this? And the explanation of this seems to be that there's nothing wrong with the other solution, and that the equations that we get don't know. But there's another expectation. I expect the equations to explain to me, or to in some way to give me nonsense if I find a way in the math to have time going backwards. So I have a time parameter, and I can say, okay, it's going to increase this way, or I can flip it around and have it increase in the other direction. And I expect that I'm going to get nonsense if I flip it in one direction. And I only expect to get something reasonable if I have it traveling or increasing in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the case. You get something perfectly reasonable. And so we sort of understand this. But the point is that we didn't dismiss something that doesn't already gel at some level with our expectations of the world, right? And so in language, we could say, well, time is a very specific kind of thing, and I expect this, and so on. And instead, we find the strange features, and we have to sort of go a little bit deeper before we start to dismiss.
Sure. Well, so I guess a question would be, going in deeper, can you provide a way to kind of reconcile or explain what is now meant by there being two different times, and how we should shift our understanding of what these things mean in this new context that goes beyond these intuitions?
Right.
Like once you get to this place where it's like, okay, well, this is our expectation, this is where it failed, this is the new picture. Now what does this new picture mean, is what I'm trying to understand.
Right. So we have an expectation that the description of the world, the laws of nature, the laws of physics, will uniquely give us a description of the world that makes sense in one time direction. In other words, the laws know about the error of time. They explain to us that, we're born young and we die old.
Mm-hmm.
The things in one direction make sense, in the other direction they don't make sense. We sort of talked about this in other contexts, and what we're finding is that they don't know about this direction of time. So that's an expectation that's not met.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a strange thing. So the explanation as to why we're born young and we die old, right? Why there's a direction to time is not something that you're going to find in these laws, in these descriptions. It's not that we don't understand it. There are some subtleties there, but it's not specifically from the laws. It has to do with something else.
Now,
okay, so the world is structured such that the laws, which you might think are the most important thing, the most fundamental thing, they don't know about this direction of time.
but couldn't somebody posit that maybe there is some missing law in the framework, that there is something missing?
Yes,
there?
and people do that kind of thing. And what is it? And so you'll see these kinds of things coming in. And that actually is something that I mentioned on the show the other day. That, again, this also involves some kind of expectation. At some level, it's a kind of expectation. But we basically see that the laws that we look at don't seem to be able to provide us with this direction. Whichever direction you use is perfectly fine. And so the explanation is somewhere else. This seems to be true of basic mechanics. It seems to be true of electric and magnetic phenomenon, the laws that describe those phenomenon. It's true in relativity. It seems to be true in quantum physics, although here's where we have, certain issues, and we have various interpretations. And one of the things that bothered me about the conversation the other day, is that here we see a unique direction to time.
Mm.
And so that seems a little strange. But it's not like we don't understand this, but it's a strange feature. So that's already sort of at the basic level of physics. We see this kind of thing. And so, we don't discard the equations of mechanics. We don't discard kinematics. We don't discard electricity and magnetism because they don't provide us with an explanation to the direction of time.
Mm-hmm.
And we look a little bit deeper and we find where that direction might come from. I know there are other, so we can look at relativity, we can look at quantum physics and see other strange features that you might think, well, this is incomprehensible. This is meaningless. This is impossible. So, for example, relativity, emerges from the idea that the speed of light is always a fixed value.
Mm-hmm.
So it just looks like an impossible thing because light is, we can think of it as some little object that's moving, right? And so I launch a particle of light, turn a flashlight on, and the particle of light is traveling with respect to me, and it's traveling with respect to me at the speed of light, this one speed. But now you start to travel, right? You start to run after this object of light at the same moment that I turn that flashlight on, and you measure the speed of that object with respect to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how does it make sense that you will find that it's also moving with respect to you at the same speed with which it's moving with respect to me?
Right.
Right? So you can't really wrap your head around that kind of thing, right? That looks like it's comprehensible in terms of words, but in terms of a mental image, it seems to be incomprehensible.
Right. Hey, Randy.
And yet we're not dismissing it, right? We don't dismiss it because behind the mathematics that allows us to ensure that thing, right, allows us to mathematically describe that from your perspective and from my perspective, we both measure the same speed, out come things like E equals mc squared, right? And we've taken advantage of that energy. So we know that there's some truth behind
There's something to that, right? Well, okay, so maybe let's kind of address the existence issue in more detail. Because I think I struggle with that idea more than what you're describing about the speed of light. So if you're saying that the picture where we contextualize the meaning of existence,
well, okay,
in this kind of framework of space and time, you want to say that that's the wrong picture, that this is based
no, I'm
on
not saying that. I'm not saying that.
Okay, so you're not saying it's the wrong picture. Then can you explain to me the meaning of a context which does remove space and time as fundamental, and wants to say that something can exist outside of space and time?
Well, I'm not here. I've given you an example that doesn't remove space and time,
Mhm.
but when I ask you to sort of visualize, right, because you're insisting on a notion of existence in space and time.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not really removing that, but when I ask you to visualize in space and time the motion of this object, this particle of light, and it's moving with respect to you at the same speed with which it moves with respect to me, but you're moving with respect to me. So now I don't think you can visualize this. And so,
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I don't really follow what that would look like.
yeah, I don't think it's possible. Right, so I think so at some level, this is not amenable to a description of something moving in space as time passes, in some sense. right? Because that picture gives you a motion of an object, and then if you're moving with respect to it, you try to make a drawing of this process. It looks like you're catching up to this object, but that's not the right picture. And so, and that's not really surprising, because what has to change are both space and time. And so our intuitions of thinking space is this kind of thing that I can draw and time is some independent parameter, that kind of picture doesn't work. And so, in other words, you are forced into a picture of things existing in space and time that you don't really know how to describe. And so, perhaps it's not fair for you to say, um, I don't know what it means for things not to exist in space and time, when in fact you don't really know what it means to exist in space and time.
Okay, so how do we make sense? Is there a way to make sense of this picture? Like, what is it that we are then saying?
We're saying that space and time depend on how you're moving.
In what way?
In a way that allows the speed of light to always be the same.
Okay, so well, going back to the existence question, what does this term existence now mean in this context of space and time as you have expressed it just now?
It would mean, well, I guess it depends on who you're asking, but if you're asking me, it has something to do with, out of this theory, I will still get a mathematical expression that tells me the position of an object as a function of some kind of time parameter.
Okay, but but Dr. Kastner wasn't saying that, right? Dr. Kastner was saying that there's
right. That's in some sense, the things that are moving around in space and time should not be thought of as really existing in space and time.
And so, how
I don't
my
know, but
question is,
I'm not. I don't know. I can't give you an interpretation of that, a specific interpretation, but we can talk about. I mean, the idea that space and time is emergent, right? We can talk about that.
okay,
and that doesn't require that space. If space and time is emergent, then there's something else there.
okay. Well, let's go there then. Explain to me what that means. That space and time is emergent, and what conclusions we can derive from that picture.
That somehow we're going to get a description of both space and time that involves different concepts. And so we touched on this briefly the other day. We think of space as we can describe space as a collection of all possible positions, and people are exploring the possibility that connections between quantities in quantum physics degrees of connections, strong connections versus weak connections, are the thing that we ultimately call closeness. So certain kinds of connections would give rise to a picture of things being close to each other, whereas weak quantum connections between physical systems would give rise to a notion of large distance between physical systems.
Can you explain to me what you mean by connections here?
Well, specifically, it's entanglement.
Okay, can you explain to me? Can you explain to me what you mean by entanglement?
Okay, so
this is the problem, right? This is the rabbit hole that we go down. It's like,
well, why is this a problem?
Well, because I think that I think the goal should be to communicate with the public what these findings are telling us about reality, right?
Right. Well, this is
And
a very specific kind of description. This is what's the
right,
origin of space?
yeah, no, and I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand, like, when physicists use these words like entanglement, physical systems,
Well,
space time.
there's nothing unprecise about the term quantum entanglement.
I'll read this comment real quick. Um, Alec says, I have a hard time believing that physicists don't have a handle on the concept of things existing in space and time, but I guess it's just an untrustworthy intuition.
Well, I'm sure that people, um, depending on which physicist you ask, they'll tell you that they have a good understanding of the concept of things existing in space and time, especially people who think that space and time are more fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But if you're someone who thinks that space and time are less fundamental, it's up to you to uh, describe that fundamental thing and show the connection, how things in space and time, how that description emerges from the deeper description.
And is that your view, that space and time are less fundamental?
Well, I don't know, but the deeper we look, the more we find things that we thought we things that we use to describe concepts that we use to describe the world to sort of give way to other concepts.
Right. Okay, so let's go back to this notion of entanglement. Can you try to explain for layman what that means?
Entanglement is just a strange kind of connection between different systems. So this is right. So we talked about quantum superposition, the idea that certain physical systems have multiple sort of incompatible properties at once. So this thing is right. One strange property is location. This object is both here and there at the same time. This object is both blue and red at the same time. This object has this property and the opposite of that property at the same time. Right. So yes, so already there you're looking at a world which
Seems to
isn't
defy
the
the laws of
world.
logic altogether.
Yeah, right. Unless you, again, it depends on the interpretation that you give to these kinds of things. There are interpretations where that logic that you're appealing to seems to be okay.
Okay.
But this is what we're forced to use. We're forced to use to describe a physical system according to the rules of quantum physics. We have multiple properties all at the same time, multiple incompatible properties all at the same time, contributing to the description of this object.
Mm-hmm.
And quantum entanglement involves objects that are in these strange superpositions that are connected to other objects that are in these strange superpositions. So that when you have an object that is in this strange combination, where the property is, say, it has these two incompatible properties, or these two sort of opposite properties at the same time, and that one also has those two properties at the same time. If I make a measurement on this this physical system, and that physical system that's connected to it is now very far away, instantly, when this system reveals its property, and its property is going to be one of the incompatible properties. I don't know if it's 1, 2, or 3. Right, so it's blue, red, and green at the same time. When you do a measurement, again, there are issues with the concept of a measurement. You'll get, let's say you get green. You get green, you kind of know that the other one is not going to be green. It automatically now has a specific color, and it's blue. Blue and green are sort of go together.
Okay.
Okay, so they're entangled in a strange way. One thing reveals has a specific property that has been measured, and the other one automatically has sort of an opposite to that. This is strange connection that occurs despite the distance. Quantum entanglement.
So
There's no classical description of this, right? There's no.
But what do you mean when you say that this property has, or this physical system has these three colors at the same time? Is this, you're saying this is before the measurement, and
Yeah,
the measurement
right.
locks the one property in
Yes,
that specific time? But so
yeah.
how do you know that that system also has the other ones?
How do I know that the other one has this
No,
opposite
how do you know
property?
that the first system you're measuring has more than the properties that you've observed in that moment?
Um, you create it like that in the laboratory. So you know how to create these superpositions.
Hmm.
These things are states that you can create in the laboratory, and
So
you
what?
can connect
Well, I
them
guess
in this way.
that'll be another question, right? Like, what does it mean to create a state that you're saying has seemingly this contradictory uh, um, descriptions or attributes? What does it
Yeah,
mean for
well,
something?
so we arrive there by doing experiments and recognizing that we need to describe the world in this way. So when you have the usual description of why we're forced to this kind of situation is the double slit experiment, where you have one object going through two slits, and the results of the experiment, this thing called the interference pattern, requires that you have to describe this particle as having gone through, in some sense, both slits at the same time. Okay, so you have multiple properties, multiple incompatible properties, because this object doesn't break up. So it's one object. So what do you mean by saying it has to be described as having gone through both slits? So that's like saying it has to be described. You need a description that involves it being in two places, two different places at once, in order to be able to explain the experiments.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an example of multiple incompatible properties.
Right. Um, okay. So going back to this conversation about existence, um, is there a way to express like a linguistic meaning to this new notion of existence that someone like myself could um, kind of hold on to something, like that I could understand what's being said there? Because I don't know. I think
The thing is, remember, we have a picture of the world. It's a common sense picture, an intuitive sense of the world, and we then go beyond that, following experiments, trying to explain experiments, trying to mathematically model those experiments, and then we look at what we have, and you're asking for what are you asking for? An explanation or a language that's compatible with your common sense
no, no,
intuition?
no, no. I'm saying if we are to accept this idea that we should abandon our intuitions and our common sense
Well,
understanding.
we should be wary of those intuitions. We should try to get around them. We should use sort of informed intuitions. Um,
Okay, so let's say that we do the experiments, we figure out that our intuitions as they are may be problematic, and so we should be wary of them. Okay, so then the science is pushing us towards this new picture. But I mean, do you agree that now we have to kind of restructure our language and our understanding to derive some meaning from this new picture? I'm not saying, obviously you're saying we can't use what we have been using, right? But we have to use something, right? Otherwise, we're not saying anything. So
well,
what do we do?
that's also not true because, for example, in the work that I do, I have to deal with strange features near black holes, for example.
Mhm.
Now, one of the features that I need to use in my descriptions is this thing called the dragging of space, or the dragging of space and time. And this kind of reduces to how could I describe this? I could use words like space is moving. Right, so I have some mathematical equations, and if, so in the work that I do, I have to calculate, for example, the energy that's emitted from near the black hole, and that energy then is going to be used to affect the galaxy in which the black hole lives. And one of the things that I have to do to calculate this is to understand, at least mathematically, the degree of the dragging of space. That determines the power, the energy that's generated from near the black hole, and then it affects the galaxy. I don't know what it means for space to be dragged. I don't know what it means for space to move. Right? I have a concept of motion that involves things, the positions of objects, physical objects, changing as time passes. So I have a difference in positions. Right? Classical notion of velocity. Right?
Mhm.
We have this value of the position at a later time. We had this other value of the position at an earlier time. We have two different times. I construct a ratio between those quantities, and I have a notion of velocity or of speed. Position changes as a function of time, and uh, that position changing is what is how I use the word motion.
Right.
And now we're talking about having to describe the motion of space with respect to space. There's a failure at some point, both of language and of concepts,
Right.
but that doesn't stop me from calculating the power of the jet. I can
Okay,
still get that, and that's an extremely useful thing.
but I don't know, like, so I guess my question is then, what are you calculating?
Calculating the jet power. There's nothing ambiguous, and I can do a very precise calculation, but I don't know how to describe this concept.
so you're calculating the jet power.
I mean, I have mathematical expressions that I can show you that involve the dragging of space, or for that matter, the dragging of space-time. But I can't describe it to you in the language that we have. I can't describe it to you in terms of the concepts that emerge in my head.
I mean, and I guess my question is there a way to describe these things in a new language with new concepts?
Maybe, but
Because
someone
here's
has.
the thing: if there
I don't
isn't,
have it.
yeah, but if there isn't, that's a problem, right? It's not a
Why?
problem
Because
for the math.
Why?
Oh,
But
well, I'll
that's
tell
the
you why it's a
thing.
problem. It's a problem because it's not actually telling us anything about the way the world is.
It's telling us precisely something about the way the world is. It's telling us that if you have a black hole of this kind, that you're going to get this kind of jet power, this amount of energy, a precise value of energy generated from the near black hole region, and you can also figure out exactly how it's going to affect its environment. So I'm not sure what you mean by it's not telling me anything precise. It's very
So
precise, or it can be very precise.
Alec is asking, can it be described instrumentally?
Yes, that's in a sense what I'm doing, right? That's what we're doing. I'm not using any specific language. I call it the dragging of space-time. It's in my mind that thing is vague conceptually. People have made cartoons. If I start to think about it in detail, I realize that I just can't get there. But I do have mathematical expressions, and I have a mathematical expression that very precisely tells me the energy generated.
So
But
you're saying
conceptually, I don't know
so.
what it means for space to rotate.
So what this is doing? So you're saying what this is doing is telling us something about the energy generated, but
Well,
it's
it's
in a
telling us
qual
everything we need to know about the energy generated.
everything
It's
we need
giving
to
us the
know.
exact same value. It's giving us the precise value of energy.
So
I
it's
just don't
giving us
understand at a
right.
conceptual level what to say, how to describe this in a way that's going to be uh, intuitive.
So it's giving us an understanding of the exactly the energy generated but in a context where now we don't know what space is anymore, and we don't know what time is
uh,
anymore.
I'm not sure why you made that conclusion.
Well, because you're saying that our understanding of space and time is fundamentally flawed, which means that our picture of those
Well,
things is inaccurate. Right? So we have to make way for a new picture. But then what you're also saying is that uh, we lack a way to be able to
well,
communicate this new picture in
right. But I started with the strange feature that a particle of light is always moving with respect to you at the speed at a specific speed. And I was trying to invite you to think conceptually about how to describe that in your mind. It's moving with respect to you at this speed, and then you see me running after it. I get into a spaceship, and I'm going almost at the speed of light. I'm going almost at the speed of that same particle. And with respect to me, I measure that particle of light to still be moving exactly at the same speed at
right,
which it's moving with respect to you. And I invited you to come to a description of that.
and it's not
And
possible.
and I don't know. Did you try?
I,
Again,
I
I fail to do that kind of.
no,
I fail
I
to
felt
really,
too.
because I have a classical intuition. Of course, then thinking a little bit about what the theory is telling us, then you realize mathematically we have to change space and time. It's a little less impossible, right? So from my perspective, space and time are different from your perspective, and maybe that's a little bit easier to start to absorb, digest. Right, but our intuition is that space is this one thing, and we can draw it, and we're going to draw these collections of all possible positions. But then, if you start to move with respect to space, you have to do something with the space, squeeze all these positions together, or stretch them all together, and the same kind of thing you have to do to time, such that the speed of light is a constant. That's not impossible. And some people have made movies where they show you what the world looks like if you're driving in your car and you're going close to the speed of light, and all these things are squeezed. The buildings are all squeezed in this direction of motion, and so on.
Right.
And so it's not impossible, but it's not intuitive. Now, whether you can
Right.
do, how far can we go with that? I don't know. But again, we have brains and we have language that have developed that's closely related to our everyday perceptions. And our everyday perceptions are not about relativity and not about these strange features. They're not about quantum physics. And so we should expect to struggle. That's not
No,
a valid reason to then throw
but
everything in the trash.
no, okay, but that is not what I'm doing, right? I'm not saying because there is this tension, let's throw
Sure.
away
But at
everything and
some
go to
level,
sleep.
you're trying. Yeah.
No, no. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to understand. Okay, let's acknowledge this tension. Let's acknowledge this problem. What do we do now that we've acknowledged it? Is there a way to then create and construct a new language, construct a new picture, construct a new
And then it
concept?
depends on people. Some people are better than others at describing things. I can. Stories are endless about my frustration with my professors who weren't able to help me understand things at a certain level, at a level of description. In my first show here, I described how my professors in relativity said, "Listen, stop asking for these descriptions and words. Just look at the math." And I wasn't happy with that.
Yeah,
I said,
I mean
"No,
that.
listen. I need to try to picture these things at some level."
But well, and that's what I'm saying is that I don't think this thing just look at the math is going to do it for somebody like me, because to me, I'm already. I think there is a degree of uncertainty about how math is corresponding to reality and the degree to which it's corresponding to reality.
What's the
So just
uncertainty?
what's that?
What's the uncertainty?
The same uncertainty that I have with language in general. It's like, and this kind of goes back maybe to the conversation about consciousness, is that if we're kind of operating through the scope of consciousness, in principle, we can never. This is what I was saying earlier about there being this barrier in principle. We can never know the degree to which our perception and our tools are corresponding with what is actually out there. So it's like, think of an ant, right? Like
Well,
an ant's perception is going to be what it is, and it can't go outside of itself to perceive the world in a different way, because it is stuck with the limitations it has. And I say the same
The
thing about us.
degree at which we fail is captured by the compatibility between theory and observation or experiment.
I think it's more than that. I think that again, we are in principle kind of stuck in our consciousness. Like there's a certain way in which our minds are structured, and I agree to some degree, to a large degree. Then science becomes a tool to undermine those intuitions, but is ultimately still within the scope of consciousness. We can never go outside of that. So how can we ever say that what we're deriving from our experience in our understandings within that scope isn't missing some other, like, how could the ant know? The ant could never know what we experience, because
Well,
how can we say
for example, in the study of geometry, there are certain tools to understand the geometry on which in which you're living,
Mhm.
and so you could imagine something like uh, if you're living in a two-dimensional space, it would be impossible for you to figure out that you're living in a two-dimensional space, and you would need to be a three-dimensional creature to figure out that the two-dimensional creature is living in a two-dimensional space. That could be that sounds like a mathematical kind of analog to what you just said.
Yeah.
But instead, in math, we find that there are tools that allow the ant, the two-dimensional, well, I'm not sure that's what you were saying, but the two-dimensional creature, to be able to figure out that he or she or it is living in a two-dimensional world. And why shouldn't that analogy sort of carry over? You're not providing it. It might be a limitation, but it's not. You haven't demonstrated that there's a limitation.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that we would never know if what we are experiencing is reality as it is. Even if it was, how would we know if we can't step outside of ourselves?
Again, my mathematical analogy is it was meant to sort of deliver you the answer to that. You can get a sense of the world in which you're living in directly without having to look outside of that world and look at, and see what your world is like from
But that is
inside of your
still,
world. You're seeing it. That's
but
just a
that is,
mathematical analogy. But I
but that
mean,
is still. It seems to me that you are still navigating through your own perception there. Like
I'm not sure what that means.
like you.
These are mathematical tools that precisely allow you to figure out what the space in which you're moving is like.
Right, but isn't even those mathematical tools still derived from the structure of your consciousness?
Okay, now I think we're having I think we're talking past each other. So I'm
Okay.
just the simple example here has nothing to do with consciousness. It has to do with mathematical tools that allow you to figure out what your mathematical world is like without having to appeal to uh, mathematical objects that are more complex.
No, I
That
understand that, but I guess what I was suggesting was that those tools are derived from consciousness in the first place,
yeah, this
right?
has nothing to do with consciousness.
Okay, so maybe I'm not.
This is a mathematical analogy that you can get a sense of your world from within your world. It's not a demonstration of anything, but the point is,
I'll have to.
I'm not sure that it might be that we're limited by our consciousness, but this isn't. We don't have a demonstration of this, right? At some point, we might not be able to go. Our imagination might be limited, right? And so we just won't be able to. Right? We got to things like general relativity through the imagination of people like Einstein and people that were working with him, right? But that required some imagination, right?
So okay, so let's try to take a step back to this idea of existence again, because I think this is what I'm struggling with primarily. Um, so, so are you saying that at this point in time, we don't have a language to put into words and concepts and pictures what it would mean for existence to take place outside of space and time. That we
There are
recognize
people
that,
who have pictures and words and descriptions and sentences to describe that kind of thing, right? And they'll get space time as an emergent property, and they use analogies like video games, where right the screen and the things moving around in your video game are space and time, right? Objects moving around in space and time, but that's being generated by something else, right? What's generating the video game? There's some hardware there. That's the more fundamental thing, and what's on your screen is the emergent reality. It's a virtual reality. So there are people who can
okay, so let me
describe
ask
these
this,
things in
and
these
this
ways.
goes back to the problem, the struggles that I have with with my intuitions, right? Which is, well, then what does it mean for that hardware, for that television that is showing all those things? What does it mean for that thing to exist? What is what?
It's the same thing as the computer game, right? That's not that the space and time is just like the interface there. It's a created world, right? It's not. It's an emergent world from algorithms that give rise to that.
Yeah, I think the problem with the analogy is that, you know,
Problem with the analogy is that you want things to be in space and time.
well,
Right?
the problem with the analogy
The
is that
computer, now you have the computer, the hardware.
right,
It's not in space and time, because the
right.
space and time and things in space and time are the video game. That's the emergent
Yeah, but
reality.
this is the problem: is that the analogy is not explaining to me the new meaning. It's not telling me. Uh, uh, it's not explaining to me this new definition of existence. Right. That's what I'm struggling with.
I think it's because you are anchored to a notion of existence in space and time. And so I just gave you a picture of space and time, matter, space, and time being emergent, and the more fundamental thing being the algorithms in some sense, right? And yet you're not biting.
Because I think there is still something missing there. It's like I can get on board or accept this idea that we have to kind of do away with these intuitions and come up with something new. But then we have to come up with something new, and I don't think that.
I think what's bothering you is that what's the space behind, in what space do these algorithms, these things that give rise to the video game,
right.
the interface, what space do they occupy? They have
And
to
what you're
occupy, they occupy an abstract space, and the abstract space of algorithms. What's wrong with that? You don't like that because, again, space and time to you is fundamental. And so if I give you some
also because
mathematically abstract spaces, right?
Well, and also because from my philosophical perspectives, I reject abstract objects, or this idea of the abstract, I think, is again completely non-intuitive to me. And so, yeah, like
then you accept non-intuitive objects, but then that means that fundamental reality is anchored to intuitive objects in your worldview,
right.
and that.
Yeah, I'm trying to kind of figure out, because I agree with you. The problem I have is that my brain wants to keep telling me, okay, so this more fundamental thing
can't be that because that thing isn't in space and time.
Right, which is
no. What's the arena for the fundamental reality? You want a kind of arena, right, where you can place things in. The point here is that this fundamental arena is not like it's not like a physical space, right? Because those things have to emerge. But they have to emerge from rules in some sense.
Like, I understand the words that you're saying, but I'm left with not knowing
Yes,
ultimately what that
ultimately
means.
that's
But
because it's very difficult to move beyond the idea that things are outside of space and time.
but how?
How
But
do we?
what I think my concern is that it's not only very difficult, is that it's actually
What if what
not
if
possible.
what if I gave you some? What if I was able to identify mathematical algorithms, uh, connections, mathematical, very precise mathematical connections that produce. Um, we could think of in quantum entanglement, degrees of connections between physical systems, defined in a very specific way, where you get degrees, precise degrees of entanglement that correspond to uh, things being a meter apart, things being 2 meters apart, things being 3 meters apart, and so a whole space where it's like as big as a room, right, generated from uh, precise mathematical rules that then when you're looking at them from a certain perspective, they translate into, centimeters, meters, to 3 meters, 4 meters, and so on, and you get a three-dimensional space where you realize that you need, distance in this direction, in that direction, and that in the other direction, right? And so you then in these algorithms see, up, down, left, right, and uh, in, out, whatever the third direction, right?
I,
But
I
but
want
that,
to, yeah. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah.
I, I want to read you these three comments that I think are interesting. One, nothing real can be described and understood purely mathematically without any reference to reality.
Yeah, sure. You can't just leave the mathematical object there. But what I just did now was to connect
Right.
some mathematical notion to quantum physics, and then suggest maybe you'll see uh, physical space. You'll see three-dimensional physical space in those uh, constructs, right?
And then this is an interesting description: algorithmic Platonism.
No, I wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't
I
say?
don't see why it's
Well, because it sounds like you're describing some abstract foundation
yes.
to everything else.
Why is
But
that Platonic?
well, I think it's kind of going along the lines of some concept of an abstract object of sort, like
Yeah,
an
sure. Of
abstract.
course, it's going to be some kind of abstract thing. It's not going to be an intuitive thing, right?
And in
We're
this
seeing that
context,
deeper. We're getting rid of space, time, and matter, and we're replacing it with something else. It's going to be abstract, of course.
so you're saying that like this idea of the physical, it's the physical is an illusion.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that in these descriptions, this might be a possibility, and physics will look very different 100 years from now when we get there, if that's the right way.
Zachariah says confusing the map for the place.
No, I'm not sure why you say that.
Suggesting maybe you'll see the physical space in the algorithms.
Yeah.
You said that the abstract
That's
algorithm is
true of physics
fundamentally,
right now.
yeah, it's a brand of Platonism. I agree.
I don't see that.
Um,
That's like saying that the kinematic equations are Platonic.
but no, I think if you're saying that what is fundamental is ultimately something that isn't physical, but some abstract foundation,
No,
then
first of all, I'm not saying that it's not physical. It's a deeper layer to physical reality. I don't know what to find it, but you can imagine that it's a deeper layer to physical reality. It doesn't mean that it has to be non-physical.
I would say that
So you wouldn't say that quantum entanglement is a non-physical
no,
kind of thing, right?
no, right.
So it's a physical thing.
Um,
So why is that Platonic?
I think I'm more confused than when we started. I just can't. It's this shit drives me crazy. Well, I think we'll have to have probably 10,000 more of these conversations before I start to get any kind of sense about what is meant by these things. What I guess. What would you say to the theist who tries to smuggle in some notion of God in saying, well, it's fine for me to say God exists outside of space and time because look at what the physicists are saying.
Sure, but that's not getting you anywhere. I mean, you don't. It's not like you have a uh, precise notion of what that means, right? You can say that, but
Yeah, I don't know. Uh,
it seems to me that you are, in some sense, doing the same thing that you criticize in some of your theists guess, which is that they want a worldview, a simplified worldview in which they have religion, God, and so on, and they don't want abstract quantities contaminating that world.
mhm. Yeah, I think that, well, I don't know. I mean, that's possible, but I think my issues with the theistic perspective is that I think it is ultimately contradictory. Like the descriptions they're trying to apply to God either lead to like a contradictory nature of this God,
But here's
or
the
to a
difference.
picture that doesn't make
So
sense.
the abstract notions that we're trying that I'm suggesting might replace the more common sense notions are related to the common sense notions in
Right.
precise mathematical ways. That
I
different. That's a fundamental difference,
Here's an
right?
I would be. I think you're taking me to maybe a misunderstanding a little bit, because I'm not saying that I'm necessarily tied, like certainly not emotionally, to a specific worldview. What I want to be able to do is
No, I don't think
derive,
it's an emotional thing. I think yours is a cognitive
right.
thing.
Uh,
You really want a platform, a cognitive platform in which to ground thinking.
what I want is to be able to understand what this new picture looks like, and if that means, and that means letting go of certain intuitions, I'm okay with that, as long as I'm able to succeed in that and arrive at some description, some new description that can still provide me with meaning independent of these intuitions.
I don't know what you mean by meaning.
A, an understanding of
I mean,
my
so
reality.
okay, but I get it. For example, when I talked about the dragging of space and time, the dragging of space, there's a mathematically precise description of that. I can give you an equation, and uh, I can also derive what would happen, the different positions in space and in time of some object that is moving in this region, right? That's subject to the dragging of space and time.
Mhm.
Yet I don't know how to conceptualize motion of space itself. What am I doing? Is it kind of like, or this thing is moving with respect to that thing, and this thing that I'm representing here is space itself. So here's space over here, here's space here, and space is moving with respect to space. Something like that. Maybe I've gotten a certain way,
Right.
but
Uh,
that's not really the concept that's in my head.
right.
That's the best I can do. But I do have some mathematical expressions there. I
I'll
don't
read you
know.
these other comments. This deeper layer is the abstract or Platonic discovers. Is it not real? It is an analog approximation based on current data. Math describes reality based on evidence. Math is not reality itself. Um,
What if
yeah,
what if the world fundamentally is just math? There are some people who would say that the world is math, and that's why we discover mathematical relationships, because that's what that is. It's math. Some people say that we're in a simulation, and the things that we are just algorithms giving rise to these things. So we're going to find mathematical expressions. So in that sense, math is reality in some sense.
that to me, at least currently, is incomprehensible. Like I think that math is a tool to try to explain reality, not that it is reality. I don't think that there's a distance between the measurement and the thing itself, and I don't think that the math resolves that. I don't. I don't know how, and I don't know enough about this to talk about it now. We can definitely talk about it at a later time. But do you know anything about Gödel's incompleteness theorem?
Roughly what it is.
Uh, I think it was used maybe unfairly, but uh, to kind of shed doubt on this view that you just expressed, that math is reality.
I'm not sure I see that. I'm not
Right.
sure I'm
Well,
seeing that. I don't think that's.
maybe I'll definitely need to read up on that more before I think we can talk about it in any depth. But I was just kind of throwing out there as a potential concern. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe we can try to think of more ways to kind of bridge these cognitive gaps. I don't know
Yeah,
how to
and
do
we
it.
have to sort of, I think, accept there's nothing Platonic about abstract structures uh, being more fundamental. I'm not sure. It's like we have an intuition that the physical world of matter, space, and time is messy, and if we go to a deeper level in terms of abstract concepts, somehow we're appealing to Platonic structures. Why should that be? I'm not sure I see that jump.
Well, maybe if you can point me, to any specific work that might help
Yeah.
me in kind of,
So
like I said,
there's all
bridging these
sorts of
cognitive
different
gaps.
ideas about what can replace the space-time matter picture.
Yeah, so maybe in the future, obviously, I'll have you back. Obviously, we can talk more about those specifics, and um,
Yeah, we
we
can
can go more
explore them
into detail.
a little bit more. Sure.
But yeah, we are past the 1 hour mark, and I gotta get some dinner.
Okay.
But as always, David, I always appreciate you coming on. These are
Yeah, that was fun.
my favorite conversations. I
Where's
much
J
prefer.
Mac?
I don't know. I don't know where Jack is.
Okay.
No, I'm sure he'll be back at some point. He's a hard one to reach
And
sometimes.
down. Yeah.
Um, I'll try to reach out to him, and hopefully, because I know he loves talking to you as well. So hopefully we can get him on board.
Sounds good.
But guys, thank you for everybody that came on and listened to this. And actually, I've been meaning to upload this for a while, but my executive dysfunction kicks my ass sometimes. But a few months ago, I had David have a conversation with a theist on TikTok. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, about the Big Bang and physics, and it was a thing of beauty. It was a complete destruction of this.
When are you going to upload it?
Probably tomorrow. I'm gonna set it up for tomorrow
I've
and
heard that
upload it.
before.
I know, but no, I will. I put an
Okay.
alarm on my phone so it will remind me.
Okay.
Um, but no, I mean the guy is back on TikTok saying the same shit that he was saying before. So, but at least there'll be a record of him getting completely schooled by you on that app. So I think that'll be fun for people to watch. But anyway, next time.